So Matt, talk us through, like you wrote a whole book on the concept of starting at the end in mind. And I feel like a lot of us, when we start a business, when we want to learn how to meditate, i.e. me right now, or we want to get fit, we just think about like, what do I have to do tomorrow? I don't always go to the end. So can you talk me through that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if everybody did it, I wouldn't have to write a book, right? It's a very natural human tendency. Humans are very oriented psychologically towards what comes next, and which makes a lot of sense. But from a strategic decision-making perspective, you want to think about like, where am I trying to go? What am I trying to get to happen? So when I'm doing this successfully, what does it look like? I often encourage people to think of it a little bit like sci-fi, right? There's the world you live in and the world you want to live in. Right. And so you need to describe the world that you want to live in before you can sort of build the bridge between the two worlds. Right. And so, right. And in part because, you need to be able to understand why we're not already living in that world. There's two really key questions, right? Why would I ever want to be in this world? And why am I not already in this world? So let's take a really simple thing, right? You mentioned, dieting, for example, right? I want to eat less candy. Well, yeah, I mean, right now it's a little easier because, you can't get access to the candy. If you don't order it, then it's not here, right? It's hard to go down to the store and get it. There's a fascinating debate raging about whether COVID is going to make people gain weight or lose weight, because there's sort of both things are happening, right? There's weird access to food right now. But there's also stress and other things that tend to make people eat more. So let's say you want to stop, eating candy. There are a series of promoting pressures, things that make you want to eat candy in the first place. And then there are inhibiting pressures, things that make you want to not eat candy, right? Stop. And so typically when we say, I want to do something less, we gravitate towards inhibiting pressures. So we say, hey, put it on the top shelf or do all these sorts of things, right? But what we don't address is, why are we eating it in the first place, right? We ignore these promoting pressures, these things that make us do it in the first place, right? So it's really easy to say, well, I don't want to eat candy. Great, I'll put it on the high shelf. I'll make it harder to get. I'll put it under lock and key, right? I won't buy it in the first place. But nobody ever really spends the time to go, well, what do I need to do to actually not want it in the first place? What's causing me to want the candy? Because that comes from somewhere, right? It's not that, I don't wander the world like wanting to eat candy. That comes from something.
Interesting. And so let's pretend we were eating too much candy in isolation and we wanted to wean ourselves off. When you say start at the end, what would be the thought process for you if we use the candy example?
Well, so it's a little less relevant. You're trying to make it into a self-help thing, right? And so like when you're talking about individual behavior, you're starting with one that's relatively easy, right? You're saying, I want to stop eating candy. Great, you started the end. You know the end point you want. You've already started with one. Right? Let's take a different example where people are more likely to make a mistake. I want to be happier at work. Well, what does that actually mean? Right? That's a process step forward. I want to go become a project manager. I want to go do this thing. But why? Like, what is the end point you're trying to get to? So people tell me, well, I want to be, happier at work. What does that mean to you? Can you describe the actual, literal, physical world that you're trying to create? Because if you can't, it's very hard to get people to, it's very hard to get someone to go improve their work life if they don't know what improve means, if we don't have an idea of what better means. So as an example, I frequently tell people, imagine you could clone yourself. So imagine you could clone yourself. What would you never let the clone do? And what would you always make the clone do? So as an example, I'm going to clone myself. I'm never going to let the clone do the dishes. I kind of like doing the dishes. My hands are in the warm water. It's kind of meditative. I can look out the window. I don't really love vacuuming. So the clone is doing all the vacuuming and I'm doing all of the dishes. Well, by articulating it that way, hey, what I really mean by a happier sort of chore balance is I'm doing more dishes and less, vacuuming. Then I can start to manipulate the pressures that cause me to do those behaviors. Like, why do I do this? Why don't I do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And so I think it's your example of I want to be happier at work is interesting too, because I think people say, I want to be happier at work. But then you're like, well, what do you want? well, I don't want to get up early in the morning. So maybe you actually just want a job that lets you work from home. Like maybe you actually, and similar to your example with the cleaning, maybe you just need to get a cleaner once a week, or get to a point where you can afford someone to do the vacuuming to take that pressure away that's making you unhappy. It's interesting. Yeah.
And to your example, like, it's amazing how often I talk to people and they say, oh, I want to quit my job.
Yeah.
Right. I want to be happy at work, so I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to do this other job.
Yeah.
But then when you talk to them, they're like, I just don't like getting up early. I'm like,
yeah,
there are a lot of ways in your existing job to fix that. Like, you don't have to go like not have get a new job to do that. Like, there are a lot of ways to address that problem. It's a little like if you're going to break up with a boy, I always say, look, try having the relationship that you want, right? If you want to go see your girlfriends more, just start going and seeing your girlfriends more and see what happens, right? You don't have to assume that you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so again, like, if you're misunderstanding what your endpoint is, right? Well, I have to just switch jobs. No, articulate what it is you actually want, because there's usually lots of ways to get to the thing that you want, right? It's never just one strategy.
So why do humans do that? Why do we catastrophize? Why do we say, I need a new job? Like, why don't we break it down? Because it's a bit more logical to go, okay, this is the problem. Why does our brain immediately go to, let's do a massive, significant change rather than breaking it down into potential solutions?
Well, part of it actually has to do, this is weird, but it supports our ego, right? When we sort of cast everything out. So here's what I mean by this. Generally, when I get to the point where I'm very frustrated with my job, I want to feel like I've already done everything, right? And so I think I have to get rid of my job because I've done everything else in the world that I could possibly do. If there was something to do, clearly Matt, the smart, intelligent guy, would have already done it, right? Like, I would have already done that thing. And so therefore, saying there actually might be things that I haven't done yet that I could do is a challenge to the ego. It says we haven't really thought about it as deeply as we could or should or might want to. And that's actually why working with someone else can be so helpful. Talking to someone else can help diffuse some of that ego stuff, because then you have the number of times people say, well, I hadn't looked at it that way, right? It gives you the ability to sort of put that on someone else, right? Someone else is bringing insight.
Right.
When in reality, if you had just sat down and thought about it, you probably also would have got there, right? But it's a little easier because now you can attribute it to someone else.
So for those of us who are just joining us, Matt has an amazing book called Start at the End, which you can get online and on Kindles and all that kind of stuff. You've worked in-house at Microsoft, Clover Health, a lot of those really big companies, specifically looking at behavior of teams and that kind of work. When you observe some of the impressive people that you've worked with throughout your career, what is it about them and what they do on a daily basis that means that they're able to achieve such success?
Yeah, I mean, so this starts to get to where the reason we call the book Start at the End.
Yeah.
Really great leaders are able to articulate clearly, this is what the final outcome should look like. This is the behavior we are trying to create. Right. And the reason is, if you can do that well, then you can create autonomy underneath, right? Really great leaders, if they say, what we are trying to do is X, now you guys have autonomy to figure out how X happens. Right. And they can scale that up and down. Mm-hmm. So it's not just being able to articulate an outcome. Lots of people can articulate an outcome. But if they can only say the outcome at the highest strategic level, then there's lots of churn underneath, right? You get this sort of like, diffusion of responsibility where everybody looks at each other and says, well, I don't know what that actually means. But if you can scale it up and down, right, to the point where you can say, hey, you intern, your job is like 25 to 35-year-old Latino women in LA downloading our app.
Right.
That's a very specific outcome.
Right.
You have total autonomy within
go and do that. Yeah.
Right. Within that zone of, so they can, really good leaders are really clear about like, here is the outcome I want. Here are the guardrails within which you can play. Go and you have autonomy. And you can come to me and say, hey, Matt, how would you do it? But I'm not holding you accountable to the process. So meaning if you showed up and you spent, a minute on it, and that if I gave you a goal for the week and you spent a minute accomplishing it, great. Take vacation the rest of the week. I don't care. Right. It is about achieving that outcome, not measuring people on process, right? Measuring people on process is just a recipe for disaster. People feel bad. They don't have autonomy. They don't feel like they get to do their best work. Right? You never really get to a place where you're feeling good, they're feeling good. You have to be able to articulate an outcome so that you can create autonomy.
What's your advice then for people who are micromanagers? Because I've worked with some wonderful people, but they struggled to provide that autonomy to their teams. And like, what would you say to people who are watching or listening who are like, oh, sometimes I don't give my team as much autonomy as I should? What's some steps that they can take to create change?
I think you have to recognize what's actually going on, right? So sometimes people are micromanagers from a habit perspective, right? I'm just used to having this level of clarity.
Right.
And when it's a habit, you need to step back and say, well, why do I have this habit and can I break it, right? Other times, micromanaging is actually a reflection of insecurity, meaning I am worried they're not going to be able to get there. And so I'm micromanaging because I'm worried that they're not going to be able to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's a matter of working with the person to say, how do you give me enough clarity to make sure that I have confidence that you'll get there? Mm-hmm. The other thing that you can do is scope down the problem, right? So saying, all right, in, this week, like, check in with me on Friday. Here is the outcome I expect by Friday, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And if Friday, if they're too junior and Friday feels too far away, fine. Monday, like, 1 day, 2 day, whatever your comfort level is.
Interesting.
It's a little bit like, so we talk about in psychology, we talk about exposure therapy.
Okay.
So let's say you were really afraid of spiders.
Yeah.
Right. So what we would get you to do is think about spiders, but stay calm. And then we're going to look at pictures of spiders and stay calm.
Okay.
And then there's going to be a spider in the room and you're going to stay calm.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then you're going to hold the spider and you're going to stay calm. Right. I know, but we do this slowly over time.
Yeah.
So you can sort of get yourself out of micromanagement the same way. Hey, I'm going to start by meeting every day. And then when I have confidence that this person is okay for a day, I'm going to start meeting every 2 days. Mm-hmm. And as I get confidence that they're okay, I'm going to start meeting every week, right? You build yourself to confidence and to autonomy. Because it is perfectly reasonable to say, I don't have enough information about this person.
Yeah.
They're junior, they just came into the company, whatever. Yeah. So I need to be in a place that I get enough information before I'm really ready to sort of take those reins off. But you do need to be working toward that process, and you need to be transparent about that. You need to be saying to them, hey, like, this is how we sort of get there. This is the cadence on which I want to do it. This is how I get to start to feel in a good place.
And you and I have talked about this before. And are there similarities between exposure theory and the nudge theory? Because I know within the PepTalkher app, a big part of the reason why we built that was to try and shift people's behavior incrementally over time. Can you talk people through that who haven't heard about the theory, like the nudge theory before?
Yeah, sure. Nudge is just a shorthand that people use in behavioral science for the fact that very small things can have very large impacts, right? And so very often when we're trying to move people's behavior, we do it in this really massive way, right? We think we have to like launch a giant campaign. And in reality, it's often very small things, right? But that's sort of why we do this sort of start at the end kind of intervention design kind of process, right? If we can articulate the endpoint we want, and we can say, remember our sci-fi, right? We want to get from the world that is to the world we want. If we figure out the world we want, then we can say, well, why is it not already that way, right? It's A, why would anyone want to live in this other world? And B, why aren't they already living in this world? And when you start to do that, you can find it's often very small things, right? I often, one of the examples I love is smoking, right? We put in place a bunch of inhibiting pressures, taxes, you got to be over 18, you have to go to the counter, blah, 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 blah. Right? You used to be able to just get them from a machine. Right now, it's quite hard, right? But what really made the difference with smoking behavior was attacking promoting pressures, right? You're not cool because you smoke. We're not going to let you advertise that smoking is cool. They can't advertise in magazines and blah, 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 right? So we get rid of all of these things.
Interesting.
So then, right, what happens is we don't address the real reason that people are doing it, right? Why do people start smoking when they're teens? Because they do want to look cool. And I want a way to get you outside the club so that we can have a conversation. Yeah. And so what do they come up with? Well, vaping, right? Because vaping, it's not that vaping was like these young people were jonesing for nicotine. They'd never been exposed to nicotine, so it couldn't be a nicotine problem. Yeah. Instead, it was a social problem, right? Like, can I borrow your pen? Can we go, like, let's go vape for a bit? Like, it was sort of technological. It felt cool, right? Like, there were all of these things that the Stanford designers that did that, that made vaping, like, did to make it that way. And it really honored a lot of the individual pieces. And so I think that there's this, really important piece of, hey, it's small things, right? It's the desire to look cool. It's the ability to sort of feel like you're in a comfortable place, right? It's, there are very few ways to talk you out of the club into someplace quieter where we might be able to sort of get a better conversation. Had we found those ways, we wouldn't have developed vaping, right? If we had figured out another way for us to go outside and do something social and collaborative, we wouldn't have, sort of filled that in. Yeah,
it's such an interesting conversation, the psychology that people use to create products like that and to create shifts in societal behavior for good and for evil. But Matt, it's been such a pleasure. Where can people keep in touch with you and where can they buy the book?
I mean, you can buy the book on Amazon and Kindle and, Audible if you want to hear me read it. It's got lots of cursing. It's a fun book. I'm very available. Like, it's easy to find me on Twitter or Instagram or other places. It's always my name. I'm Matt at mattwallaert.com if you want to schedule a call because you've got something going on. I as you and I've talked about before, right? So gender equity is a huge thing for me. So in particular, if people are thinking they're going to ask for a raise, trying to reposition their career and they're underrepresented, so women or people of color, please, send me a note and let's see if we can find some time to do that. And thanks so much for spending some time with me today. It's sort of we got 2 screens going on.
It's all happening. It's been fun.
My first ever Instagram live.
Well, it's been wonderful. You're great. And Matt is an amazing ally. And he also built an amazing product, which we didn't actually get time to talk about, called GetRaised.com, which is a great resource as well for people looking to negotiate and advocate for a pay raise. So grateful for all the work that you've done. Thank you so much.